Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Yousuf Eltagouri, who works on stabilization programming in the Middle East and North Africa at DT Global. And today we'll be talking about Libya. It's been in the news a lot with all sorts of things that are going on, both on the ground involved in the unrest inside the country and with international actors involved. So Yousuf, I think this is your third time on the show, so thanks for coming back.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, I think because Libya is a complicated conflict, I think we should start basically where we left off the last time. Still remains. Go ahead. I mean, there still remains two blocks involved in Libya, but there's been a lot more involvement of external actors. So maybe just pick up right there and just give us a lay of the land.
Yeah, since the last time we spoke, there's been a lot of developments in terms of external actors increasing their role in Libya. Primarily in the past few months, mainly the fall of 2019, we saw a large spike in Russian influence, primarily through Russian mercenaries and uniformed personnel on the ground in Libya, backing Hiftar. And in response, Turkey also increased their role in the conflict, primarily at the end of around December into early 2020 by authorizing the use of Turkish troops. However, that has not necessarily translated into reality on the ground. So right now, Turkey has actually been sending a large number of Syrian rebels from Idlib within the past few weeks. Around 2,000 are estimated to be on the ground in Tripoli to back the GNA. So we're seeing a bit of a more increase in terms of external backing. That has really driven Libya moving towards a peace progress in terms of the international community's response to this increase of external actors in Libya. So it's kind of ironic as you see as more military intervention increases, we're seeing a lot more push for a peace process to avoid a full-out international conflict in Libya.
I mean, let's drill down on each one of those actors separately. I mean, Russia is kind of a curious case. So they did intervene. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the reasons why they intervened? I mean, Haftar, he's kind of an interesting character, and he's ostensibly, quote unquote, winning the conflict, but he hasn't made much progress since the last time we spoke, which was he advanced to sort of the outskirts of Tripoli. So what was Russia's reasons for getting involved in how it did?
Yeah, so Russia's reasons for getting involved, they have been working with both Hiftar and Siraj, trying to play both cards of the conflict and seeing it's more of an opportunistic role to try to hitch on to whoever they think might turn up on top. So more recently, they've increased their role through mercenaries, through the Wagner group. And have been trying to cozy up to Hiftar because at the time Hiftar had made strides in the front lines and was predicted to come up on top. So in the type of specific support, they have been providing arms, particularly snipers, weapons and expertise on the ground to the LNA and to Hiftar to try to make that final push for Tripoli.
But that push hasn't really been successful, right? I mean, so I'm always questioning, like, yes, the Russians did put in mercs. Yes, the Russians have been Hiftar curious for a while before they ultimately, sort of tilted in his way over the GNA. Have they been were they critical enablers towards a renewed offensive on Tripoli, or are they? Is that still a work in progress?
Yeah. Well, Moscow's military and financial assistance to Hiftar was never meant to be decisive. It was just meant to keep Hiftar in the fight. So that's where I kind of see the role of the mercenaries. It was never meant to push Hiftar into Tripoli. It was just meant to keep him in the fight at the time, and to keep him going, and to keep morale going, and to try to keep the front lines intact. Um, to more of a pressure campaign on the GNA, as opposed to sending in enough force to go in and take over the city.
And what's interesting is that this is, I mean, we should also say that it's not just Russia that supports Hiftar, but it's largely
Correct.
the United Arab
Yeah.
Emirates, to a lesser extent, Egypt, and also France. Am I leaving anybody out there?
No, no. Jordan has had an increased role in supporting arms, but mostly it has been used to funnel arms through Jordan and then into Libya. But they do have a role, not quite as big as the countries you mentioned. But Russia by far has had, in comparison to the UAE, has had a significantly smaller role in this conflict. If we're talking about the length of this, the UAE has been involved in backing Hiftar primarily through air support and airstrikes for years, and has significantly impacted the war, by and large, more in comparison to Russia has been able to do in the past 3 or 4 months.
And so interspersed within this is the role of Turkey, my country of expertise,
Yeah,
uh, which has been a big backer of the GNA for a while now. But they ultimately decided to get overtly involved on the ground. I mean, I always say that Turkey has been a primary supplier of arms, and I do believe there's been covert assistance, not so covert. I mean, you've
yeah,
seen clear indications of Turkish munitions, particularly armed drones, that have been going to try and offset perceived advantages given to Hiftar by the UAE in particular. But clearly, since December, this has ramped up. First,
yeah,
with the signing of a MOU
mhm.
with Libya on the delineation of maritime boundaries, which is a whole other podcast, which
Yeah,
we won't get into that one. But also, to try and play a decisive role in the peace process. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the role of Turkey and within the GNA and how it's, I guess, playing out?
yeah. So more recently, Turkey has stepped up its support, primarily following the MOU, the two MOUs that were signed, one for regarding the maritime boundaries, and the other one for security support. Uh, so it was, in a way, in my personal opinion, uh, a way for Turkey to leverage the GNA into signing the MOU regarding the maritime support, and in return, Turkey would sign a security MOU with the GNA. And that really essentially came out of desperation on behalf of the GNA, because they had been losing support internationally, by the UN, by typical international governments that should have been supporting the GNA in theory, and that lack of support and that lack of morale on the ground, and the fact that they were losing, they were losing the war to, or at least this campaign. They were in critical need of external support. And Turkey had long been backing the GNA, as you said, through arms. So signing this MOU was a way for Turkey to get what they needed in terms of the maritime boundaries, and it was essentially a lifeline to the GNA, to stay alive in this fight.
Yeah, I mean, do you think? I mean, so what we've seen is, again, there was that not so covert assistance, which became overt, but to
Hmm.
date, the footprint of regular Turkish troops in Tripoli is, I mean, I've
It's
seen estimate
minimal.
is very small,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's minimal.
I
It's
mean,
mainly it's mainly advisors, and support, as opposed to uh, uniformed troops. And I don't predict that Turkey will be sending over in uniformed troops anytime soon.
and so they
Yeah.
essentially they've outsourced this to you know elements of the Syrian opposition, which they underwrite in Syria, offering them higher salaries. I think some reports put it as
Mm.
high as $2,000 per month.
Yeah, and as
Um,
well as citizenship into Turkey, which is quite lucrative as well. I mean, great incentive tool.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know. I mean, I can tell you the Turkey part of this, but I'm
Yeah.
curious, from your understanding of the GNA and the thing. I mean, are they satisfied with Syrians, or are they a little miffed that they aren't getting real troops?
Yeah, I would go with the latter for sure. I also don't think it plays well in the GNA's favor either, because the idea of sending over Turkish troops would provide the GNA with a sort of legitimacy that they are the legitimate government in Tripoli, and because of that, Turkey went through all the official channels to send them a legitimate army to back them up. And the fact that Turkey is now sending over Syrian rebels, which Hiftar and his side has declared as jihadists and terrorists, by sending them over to the GNA to fight on the front lines, um, it almost spoils the facade of legitimacy that the GNA was trying to have. In addition, they are Syrian rebels. They're not the promised Turkish uniformed troops, and the stature that comes along with sending an army into the country. On top of that, Libyans don't foresee any exit strategy in terms of what's going to happen to these Syrian troops when they return, or if they will return back to Syria. The issue with that is many have feared that they might bring along more Syrians, and they're not sure what to do with them once this conflict is over, as opposed to having Turkish troops who are enlisted, who are on contracts. They have a clear exit strategy. So those are a few of the issues that are surrounding the influx of Syrian rebels now.
Yeah, and I mean, and so this created a dynamic between the Turks and the Russians to try and get their two sides, Hiftar and
Yeah,
the GNA, to at least sign up to a Russian and Turkish backed process.
yeah.
Can you
It
walk us through
essentially, yeah.
the Moscow summit, maybe?
Yeah, it essentially propped Turkey and Russia to now become the two main stakeholders in the international community to kind of to predict, not predict, but to be able to really determine the outcome of this. So the Moscow summit, if you will, it really did come out of nowhere, and many believe that Russia strong armed Tifter into coming to Moscow to sign this agreement with Siraj. The main outcome of that was that a tentative ceasefire was agreed to. However, Hifter never signed off on any peace treaty or any type of written agreement. That ceasefire, the truce is ongoing. However, the ceasefire has sort of fell apart, particularly in the last couple of days. That hasn't been able to hold. But the Moscow summit really showed to the international community that Russia and Turkey were now the main actors, and they could determine the outcome of this war, and they could determine the beneficiaries of Libya's spoils.
Yeah, and it would seem to have been, like mimicking the Astana process, which Turkey and the Russians
Yeah, there was a lot of
oversee in Syria.
insinuation. There was a lot of insinuation of a process similar to the Astana process, in terms of Turkey would receive some. It was in Turkey would receive something in exchange for Russia back, or Russia would exchange benefits from the Syrian conflict in exchange for Turkey to back off in Libya.
Right.
Mm.
And it seemed to have been at least duplicative, or at least trying to hijack what has been the Berlin conference. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. So maybe you can explain to
Yeah,
the
yeah.
listeners the intent of the Berlin conference, and then ultimately what the outcome was.
Yeah, so the Berlin conference it was an attempt as a Germans backed meeting to try to path forward to rein in international and outside actors, really covering everywhere from financial support to mercenaries. And the hope was if they could rein in uh, these external actors, it would be able to help. It would be able to cut off the supply of weapons, of arms, of financial support to the conflict, and really reduce the amount of violence on the ground. Um, the Berlin conference really did come as a result. I think it gained a lot more traction, a lot more international buy-in as a result of the Moscow talks, primarily by Europe and the United States, who were left out of the Moscow summit and have really significantly taken a step back in the past year or so from Libya. So seeing Turkey and Russia call the shots on Libya at the Moscow conference, while that summit didn't 100% work and it did fall through, it was really a reality check for Europe and the US, just to see how far retracted they have been from this conflict. So the Berlin conference was really a European and US pushed attempt in the week between the Moscow conference and the Berlin conference to try to really rein in Turkey and Russia and try to take control of the international aspect of Libya's conflict.
Was it successful?
It was, in theory, it could be successful. So really, after the end of the conference, all the actors came out with a joint statement, 55 points in which they would adhere to cutting off support, all the usual jargon, basically claiming that they will stop funding their respective sides, they will stop sending arms, and they will stop funding their patrons in country. There is no follow-up. There is no really mechanisms to monitor that, as well as there's no real repercussions for those who do not follow with this agreement. So in theory, it could work. However, in the past 5 days or so since the Berlin conference, we've already seen violations of that. And we've already seen, especially last night, increased violations of the ceasefire that has relatively held on the ground for the past week or so.
So, I mean, if we're going to project forward as we wrap the podcast up here, I mean, where do you think this is going? I mean, Hiftar seems to have rejected or at least resisted Russian pressure. Do you think he'll give in? I mean, the Turks seem to have created a pathway to interject foreign forces, albeit not their own, into the conflict. And as I understand it, the Emiratis are also trying to give Hiftar some more support here. So, I mean, is there any elements of the conflict that are closer to being resolved, or the divide still deeper? Still pretty deep.
I think the Berlin conference bought time. I think it buys Hiftar time to see if he can renegotiate certain terms of an agreement. In the end, I don't see that actually panning out. I do see a revival of the conflict, and I do see that both external actors will continue to, if not increase their support to Hiftar and Siraj respectively. The Berlin conference, in theory, was good, but the lack of follow-up and the lack of really buy-in other than rhetoric, I don't see that really panning out and really producing any real results on the ground.
Well, with that, Yousuf, is there anything we didn't cover that we should talk as we close here?
I think no, I can't think of anything. But I think we covered most of the topics in the past few months, largely.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, Yousuf, thanks for coming on and walking us through this. I appreciate it. And I guess we'll check back in a couple of months as this thing keeps going.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me again, Aaron.
Sure. Thanks, everybody, for listening.